Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time here. And yes, as was introduced, what I will be doing is for this 1 hour or so, I will give an overview of that, of identity, place, and neoliberalism in Malta. And now that might seem a lot to unpack. In fact, on some topics, we will be just touching the surface. It's not my intention to, delve very deeply in philosophical thoughts about each of those 3 words. There would be a lot to say about each of them. But my main intention here is to connect what's happening globally in terms of politics, economy, and situate that within the context of Malta, and more specifically in terms of space. That is how certain processes that have been happening for decades beyond Malta, we can see them become placed in the Maltese context, and what is the effect of that? So, first I will be having a look at the neoliberal aspect of all this, so the political and economic model, and then we'll look at how that is affecting spaces in Malta, the formation and transformation of space in Malta. And then I will be try to look at how that actually then affects us, how the formation of space also contributes to the formation of us as individuals, also as collectivities in a way. And then also try to look at what resistance there is to all this. Neither is absolute, nor the resistance to the neoliberal space, neither that, nor the hegemony of the neoliberal space. It's something that there's always a tension, there are always competing visions, and so I'm interested in that also because of my activism background. Of course, we try to foster more the resistance aspect, but we come across all the time both dimensions of it, the hegemonic aspect of it, the dominance of neoliberalism in Malta, and also how that translates at the level of individuals in terms of our aspirations, our thoughts, our values. So that's one aspect of it, but also the resistance it engenders. So that's more or less the outline of what I will be saying in this hour. Okay, so to define neoliberalism, it's something that is very hard to do. I wouldn't even term this as being a definition. There are some who even challenge the term itself. There's some that would say that neoliberalism doesn't even exist. It's an invention. It's not something that we really can locate in political and economic processes that took place over the last 30 years, let's say. I think it is a useful concept to look at in terms of the changes that occurred, especially starting from the 70s onwards, because I think at that point, capitalism did enter a new phase. Now, one can term that whatever one wants. I think the term neoliberalism is a useful one. But this is not some universal definition of it. It's very hard to find one. This is what I find the best way to explain my thoughts in this case. What I personally understand by it and how it can be perhaps distinguished from other phases of capitalism and also other periods. So, it is a worldview one has to qualify that the neoliberal idea is mostly a political idea, not an economic one. It is an idea of how the social, the economic, the political should be structured and practiced. So it includes an economic aspect of it, but it is most of all an political concept. One, a worldview that puts the private over the public sphere. One that prioritizes commerce over the common good. This is very important. One that is focusing on individual choices. Perhaps one could add freedoms over collective action and collectivities. What has this led to in political terms? Well, tax cuts, for example, because taxes are seen as something repressive, something that are hindering the free market, the free choice of individual. The state should have no role in that. So we have seen over the past decades a pattern of tax cuts, especially on the most wealthy. Privatization, clearly, because it's something where the public is not seen as something positive. The individual can express his or her freedom through private enterprise. We can, the moment there is a public good or space, that's in a way seen as useless, as not something that we really can take something out of it that is useful for us. Deregulation of financial markets, for example, but in different spheres. It could be planning, the media, again, because there should be no rules. Whatever the individual choices and actions, whichever course they take, they should be let free. And free trade. Again, for the same reasons and philosophy behind it. What is the trajectory? So it actually started being theorized in the post-war period by economists, philosophers, such as Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, George Stigler. But it was only in the 70s that it started to gain more prominence on the global level, mostly in the United States and in the European continent, and because there was a crisis at that point. So following the post-war period, there was this Keynesian economic approach, where it was still completely a capitalist system of enterprise, of companies, of capital being invested by the private sector in industries, but that was coupled with quite a considerable intervention from the state in terms of providing a welfare state, of providing regulations, for example, regulation for workers' rights, regulating wages, regulating conditions at work, keeping certain key industries and sectors within the public sphere. But in the 70s, there was some kind of trouble with all this. There was some stagnation. It was still a capitalist model in place, but it wasn't moving forward anywhere in a way. So what had been theorized in the post-war period, there was a deliberate action to make those philosophies gain more prominence and make the people think more about them as an alternative to the Keynesian phase, and also which coincides very much with the social democratic ideal. The fact that we can have a capitalist system in place, but at the same time still having state intervention in terms of regulation, in terms of intervention in certain economic sectors, for example. And so then it becomes, the neoliberal model becomes the dominant model in the world in the 1980s through Thatcher, Reagan. It's where for example, in Britain, there is probably deliberate fight started by Thatcher with the miners, which were the backbone of the workers' movement. It was done probably deliberately to crush them, so that it crushes the resistance that there could be then to the implementation of this neoliberal model. And then when there are privatizations, deregulation of financial markets, but also of housing, for example, until the 80s, the state was still very much expected, even here in Malta, to very directly intervene in housing by, for example, having an obligation to provide housing. That starts being removed in the 80s. It was, the people could now buy their own property, even if it had been built by the council or government itself. The people were incentivized. Thatcher, that's one of the measures that she is most remembered for, the fact that you could be your own property owner. But that happens across all sectors. Tax cuts, the same happens in the US. Probably neoliberalism becomes even more entrenched and in a more powerful way in the 90s. However, Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, there is that famous Thatcher quote when she's saying what was her biggest achievement, and she said, Tony Blair. Because basically Clinton and Blair, they took all those ideas of deregulation, leaving, putting the public aside as much as possible, prioritizing the private over everything else, and they mainstreamed it, they normalized it. Giving this impression, again, a Thatcher quote, that there is no alternative. And they took that on. They said, it's true, there is no alternative to this. We'll play with this. We'll take the neoliberal approach in the way we will manage our economies, our spaces, workers. And so we had seen, and we still see until now there are debates whether we are still going through the neoliberal phase or not, because there have been crises then along the way. Well, I won't go into that right now. But for sure, this idea of deregulation, of privatization, it was there to stay. There are only few exceptions to that. Okay, so this was like a very brief overview. Again, the intention of this is not to really go into depth in terms of what neoliberalism means. That's not the point of it. It's just to give a very basic account of it so that then we can look at this in terms of what happened in Malta, specifically what happened in terms of the formation of space. Okay, so another concept now. Again, we could have huge discussions on this. What is space and place? How are we going to define them? There are debates. There are academic, theoretical debates on this. I will just give an outline, a very brief outline. So the idea of space and how it is distinguished from place is the fact that when we are talking about space, we are talking about the non-symbolized surfaces. A surface and space that has no particular meaning attached to it. Space becomes place through a number of factors, but when it becomes part of the social relations, when it starts to have meaning to the people that use it through their practices, through going there, through being part, relating to their identity, who they are as both individuals, as groups, then that becomes place through these place-making activities. It could be hanging out with others in a place. It could be where we do barbecues, picnics, where we live, where we work. It could be farmers tilling their fields, social, cultural events that take place in these different spaces, thus giving them meaning. So there is a whole process there through which place is created, but also in turn, place and space creates us. All these activities that I have just mentioned, they have an effect also on us, on who we are in terms of identities. They create social distinctions. Different places become associated with different identities, with different groups. It could be in terms of gender, ethnicity, social class. So talking and inhabiting place becomes a way then also of the way the social context is organized. And so this quote is about that. It's about that it is the creation of place, how space is organized, is not just a reflection. It is not just a result of the social relations that, we form, that take place. It is also part of it. It forms us. It has a formative effect on who we are, how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others. So that is the power of place in a way, that this is not merely a result of something. It is in itself something that contributes to how we feel, who we are. Then, if we try to look at that from the now more global perspective and from the capital also point of view, because I will be talking more about all this, it's about, of course, we are living in a world of flows. Again, this when we talk about place and space, this is a debate, but what do we mean? We are living in an increasing world of flows, of images, people, objects, money, of course. And does that erase place? Does that make place redundant because now we inhabit this world of flows? And I would say no. That's not. Yes, we do live in the space of flows. What is that point there? The time, space, compression do take place. It is true that, space now is not as big as it was because things can move much faster. Workers, tourists, money, commodities, everything flows much faster. But it is still, at the same time, placed. Those flows, although very intense and very fast, they still create distinctions and spaces that they have different identities, different functions. So place is still happening even though the flows have become so intense. Now, looking at some other important points I will be mentioning when we will be looking at the case of Malta. So David Harvey looks at some, these are again very much touching the surface of all of it, at how capital shapes space and to what end, and what is the impact of that. And a few things we could look at here are, for example, what's called the spatial fix. It is this idea that capital, especially in certain periods, especially when going through a crisis, for example, it needs to open up territories to invest in them, and eventually also to make profit out of them. So that is when the redirection of capital comes situated in geographic expansion, making use of space to directly turn a profit from it. For example, in Malta, we could see some very clear example with real estate, something that I will be looking at this more in depth soon. The fact that a lot of the economic aspect and how the capital in Malta, what it has been investing it is to turn a profit out of building luxury apartments, for example, but not only. And so through space, very directly, through, as we will be seeing, through the changing of planning policies in Malta, through the privatization of public spaces, these territories, these geographical expansion can take place. Those spaces become opportunities from where one can invest, basically. The time-space compression aspect, it's about, among other things, the rapid global circulation of capital. Well, we can look at a few examples in Malta, from Malta too, like gaming companies coming here and the workers they bring and the profits they make and the activities that gets created to cater, for example, for their workers. We had, for example, 3.5 million tourists in Malta last year, and they say they want to make this grow up to 4.5 million. Again, this is about, that intensity of flows, of movement of persons in this case, but it also leads to other movements, again, of commodities, of money. That is certainly something that has to do with this time-space compression that happened and that has a major contributor to the transformation of space in Malta. And then the production of space, which is a more broad concept, and it's about how the social organization and reorganization happens, takes place, is planned to meet the needs of capital in terms of organizing the workers, organizing and fostering consumption, also techniques of control over space. We can see shopping malls, we can see waterfronts, hotels, but then also we can see many of the workers working in those places, living in overcrowded apartments in Malta. And this is all about the organization of space and where capital and where resources are going, in which space, who's benefiting, who's not. So these are some of the, when we talk about space and place, now that we are trying as much as possible to connect it with the neoliberal aspect of it, we're looking at that. We're looking at these flows and how they contribute, how they are a determinant factor in our organization of space in Malta. I'm sorry if this is a bit abstract for now. We will be moving forward to look at some examples very soon. So this is just a very brief overview of how I would describe the economic model in Malta. It's one where there is a massive emphasis. The main emphasis is on economic growth. Of course, Malta is not alone in all this, but Malta has invested a lot in making the economy grow as much as possible, and I would say at all costs. It has constantly, for the past decade, had one of the highest economic growths in the EU. And that economic growth is mostly driven by private investment, by also private profits. It has kept a very low level of regulation, whether in terms of employment, in terms of services, planning, construction. Regulation has been kept to a minimum so that this economic growth is incentivized as much as possible. Well, this we have seen that it is leading to a growing uneven distribution of wealth. Taxes, for example, on very high income in Malta are quite low. Wage growth has also been relatively low. But it's a model that is very much, there is one major difference from the typical, however, neoliberal economic model in this case. And the main difference is that Malta, well, with the neoliberal model, there is most often austerity. There is less investment, for example, in healthcare, in the welfare state, in pensions, in education. Well, that did not take place in Malta. Government in Malta kind of knew that the support, the political support it will manage to obtain was by still putting a lot of money in the social services and the welfare state. So it is mostly a neoliberal approach to letting the private sector drive the economy through deregulation as much as possible. So those features are all there, I would say, bar one of them. And that is, Malta has still has increased, I would say, the investment in the welfare state. And that has allowed government to keep consensus, I would say. So it was, okay, let's make the economy grow as much as possible. Oh, it's okay, we keep conditions of work and wages low. Let's not regulate planning, construction. But then the little that goes to government from this growth is enough, because the growth is so big, for government to sustain and, I would say, increase services. Okay, so I'll be looking now at some particular features of how the neoliberal economic model in Malta has impacted space. One of them is the privatization of land. Now, the privatization of land actually starts in the 60s, but it's a very different kind of privatization of land to the one we have now. It was mostly in the 60s, it's mostly for some hotels. We're trying to increase the tourism industry in Malta, factories. We're trying to have production in Malta. That changes a lot in the 90s. In the 90s, land started being privatized for real estate, also for hotels, but also luxury accommodation, to create gated communities. So, and here it's where we can really see clearly the neoliberal model being applied to Malta, where the public spaces, they are seen as not having value. For Chambret, Inia Point, Manuel Island, Smart City, it goes on, of course, not only in the 90s then. More recently, the ITS zone, or these were all places that were privatized for that most of them, some of them foreign, some of them local capital. And the idea, of course, it's something in terms of the discourse that is used. Malta, the discourse of JIT, of wealth, is something that has quite almost an emotional response to it, because as a post-colonial country, a small island, where there are no clear and immediately apparent natural resources like oil, for example, of course, there was this idea, there was very much this concern with creating wealth, JIT. And if you see different parties, the idea of the creation of wealth, of JIT, whether it's coming from the more left-wing socialist perspective or more the right-wing one, however, that is always there. We don't, actually, it's not much. It was the issue was never much about equality or about the distribution of wealth, but we were very much concerned about the creation of wealth. How are we going to grow our economy? What wealth and how? Where are we going to find this wealth? And it's understandable, I say, but in the 90s, that takes on a different kind of meaning. Now, wealth is seen in terms of privatization. And that is the main difference. It is, we start having this idea that privatizing a space or an industry will bring us more wealth. This is also something, a recurrent theme, will take us into modernity. Also, we have this urge to feel modern. And privatization was linked to it. Having the private sector take over our spaces, for example, that is what will take us in the modern era. And I would say until recently, this was quite something widespread. So it wasn't just linked to a political elite. Many would think in those terms. Now I feel, maybe I'm wrong, that it's changing at the national level. Now, seeing our spaces or other aspects of our economy, for example, privatized is not necessarily seen as something positive as it was seen in the 90s. So yeah, there have been always some resistance to it. Those are protests against the Hilton in the 90s. I come from the activist organization movement Graffiti, and that was one of the first campaigns of graffiti at the time. Now again, that was already land that have been privatized in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, actually. But the change was that now a large part of it was going to be used not for a hotel, but for real estate. To build a tower for luxury apartments that were going just to be sold and profits made out of them. For Chambray in the 90s, and again the issue is coming back again now because the project was not completed in any way at that time, and now it just has been approved by the PA because there were some issues with the flows of capital in that case to be put into this place, and now it seems it's there, and so they can do this project that had been promised in the 90s. Smart city, again, this was promised as something that was going to be a hub of IT. But actually, from the beginning, quite a significant portion of it was not going to be for IT. That was, in a way, a lie they peddled at the time. It was going to be real estate. Public land that was privatized to build luxury apartments to be sold. And even then, the IT component of it did not actually actualize. So then we have the de facto privatization of public places in Malta. So it is still nominally government land. Government still has control of it. But in practice, it is taken over by private interests, by commercial establishments. This is something we see in our beaches, pavements, squares. Well, I'm sure, we're in Valletta. It's a very clear example of all this, where, like, the largest part, it's not, there was always the aspect that a public place could be used by a commercial establishment. It's not something new. It's not something neoliberal in itself. But the moment the public place is seen primarily as a place to be taken over by commercial interests, as it is right now, that has very much to do with this neoliberal idea that a place exists, a space exists, because, I mean, its utility at the end of the day, if capital can be put into it. And this we'll see with deck chairs, umbrellas, tables, and chairs, all sorts of activities where there is this expansion of the private over the public space. Of course, something that we have been, as Movement Graffiti, working a lot on, and I think it makes this whole thing very clear, it's what happened in the planning sector in Malta. So we already had in 2006, when there were the local plans and the rationalization exercise, where swathes of ODZ land were included into the development zone. That's clearly about the spatial fix. Developers clearly wanted that. Developers said, we need the land we can profit from. Give it to us. And millions of meters squared were included in the development zones overnight. They were now open for speculation. Again, what happened was in 2014, when hastily a number of planning policies, some of them could look like minor interventions to policies that already existed, or a new policy just a few pages long that one at face value would see that this is not going to change much. But it changed everything. It opened the floodgates to construction in Malta. So many. Again, for example, they created a policy on ODZ where they opened up now all the countryside to all possible forms of structures. Structures that could be sold, that money could be made out of them. So villas, if you have just a few stones in a field, you could say that someone lived there in the 1900s and now you have the right to transform that into a villa with a pool. So-called sheep farms, 4 stories high, stables. There were also, it was done on purpose. They created all sorts of loopholes so that this huge chunks of our countryside could be opened up for development, for profits. This was a very minor change in the policy regulating height, where they just transformed what is in the local plan in terms of stories. They transformed that in terms of height. So you could build more stories than allowed in the local plan as you kept to the same height. At the same time, they changed the sanitary regulations, like in regulating shafts and yards, making them smaller, making the rules more lax, so that all of a sudden, from a building that could take, let's say, 5 stories, now that could take 5 apartments there, now you could build 10, double that. That means double money you can make out of it. That has incentivized the construction boom we have seen. Because maybe it was not so worth it to pull down a house to build 5 apartments instead of it, but it was worth it to pull it down and build 10. And that has led to an intensity of construction to construction everywhere, because all of a sudden this territory was opened up for profits, and this was everywhere, cutting across towns, villages, rural, urban. It had a massive impact on Malta and of how we perceive and how we experience space. The people saw literally overnight the landscape they had been used to change, beside all the inconvenience of relentless construction all the time, because at the same time also there were no regulation on the construction process itself. So how the buildings actually should come up, what rules, what health and safety, respect for residents. There was none of this. And none of this was introduced. This is, again, the neoliberal aspect. So all the policies, the planning policies were changed to incentivize as much as possible buildings everywhere, but not introducing even basic regulations that would safeguard residents, workers' health, because by introducing those regulations, we would have kind of hindered the private sector from driving this economic growth we were obsessed with. So there's a number of them. I will not go through all this, but yeah, there were a lot of these changes that open the policy for hotels, for example. Again, it doesn't seem like a major thing, but it had a major impact. Across the board, all hotels in Malta could increase their height by 2 stories everywhere. For some, it wasn't even 2, it was as many as they want. And I would say that most of these were introduced in 2014, 15. Many were not even taking notice of this. There was a new administration at the time. There was still a bit this honeymoon period too. And also there was this sense that this will bring wealth for everyone at the end of the day. I think the change I sense personally from that time to now, I think is quite a massive change in terms of perception. I think now there is much less acceptance to it. I mean, that illusion has now faded in a way. I mean, it's true. The economy grew. Many made money out of this, not just the big developers or business persons, but when you put things on a balance, you do the sum of this and what the people took and what they lost, I think many now I realize that they have lost a lot. Also, the planning authorities in Malta, that structurally, I mean, they are always under the control of one political party, which is the political party in government. They would even allow developments that even the lax policies that had been created would not have allowed, actually, but the PA would always go over and above that and do everything possible to approve applications everywhere they are. So why was this approach? And I would say there are 3 levels of this. One, it needed to open up the space for this profit-driven economic growth. So it's not just about making the money from the space. The space needed to be ready for this growth. If you are going to have workers being brought from abroad to work in Malta imported around, like in a decade, it went from having like 5,000 third country nationals working in Malta to having almost 100,000 third country national working in Malta. I mean, you needed places where they could live. You needed spaces for offices, for buildings. So to accommodate all this neoliberal economic growth, you needed to open up the space for it. Of course, also the land, the space itself, allowed businesses to make profits, developers, especially by building, selling, buying. But there was another aspect of it. And this also has to do very much with the neoliberal aspect of all this. It gave us all the impression that we have a stake in this. We have a stake in the system. We are, whatever small piece of land I have, and Maltese do have a few pieces of land, that will mean an opportunity for me. Also for me to become at least a little rich. And so, then it's difficult to have opposition to all this if the people feel that they have a stake in this system. But there are cracks in all this. I'm still talking about the hegemonic aspect. Of course, there are cracks. It's not the dominance of all this is not absolute at all. It also has to do with the approach to property in Malta, where we see, how do we talk in Malta about having even an apartment, having even a house for yourself? We talk about it in terms of investment. This is something I always used to argue with my parents about this. They would tell me, I didn't have my own place, I still do not. And they say, you need to invest in a place. That would be a place I'm just buying to live in it. I'm not investing anything. I'm not trying to turn a profit out of it. This is not an investment for me. This is just managing to buy a place to have a roof over my head. It's not an investment. But we talk in terms of property and housing, not as something that we need to fulfill basic human needs and ensure basic rights, like it was until the 80s, where the state, for example, was expected to provide housing. Now, no, we talk about it always as a for-profit investment. And this is a very generalized approach in Malta. Also, Malta has been repeatedly marketed and aggressively marketed as a place where the wealthy can invest by purchasing property here. There are fairs that they go to together with developers when they promote Malta as a place where it is a good investment. And probably, in that sense, it would be a good investment so far, because having a property here so far, it does seem that in some years it would give you some returns on the capital you would have invested in it. But that is how we are seeing it, Malta. So property, buildings, land, it's a question of money. It's not seen as a resource that we have to take care of it and see how to best organize it so that it fulfills our needs, not just the basic needs, but also our social needs. No, it is primarily and almost exclusively seen in terms of profits. Even when there are government schemes that, for example, help couples or young person to purchase their first home, it's always about incentives. It's always about giving fuel to the market. It's about subsidies in rent, not regulation in rent. It's always, actually, we want this market on fire. We do not see anything wrong. If you see all the political speeches from both parties, they are always extra careful to make it clear that they want this market on fire. No matter that this market on fire leads to an affordable housing for many, especially young persons who do not yet own a place. But that's not really considered. Okay, so after having looked at some of the, maybe not all, but of some of the dimensions in Malta linked to the neoliberal space, how this is created, sustained, let's try to have a look at the impacts of all this. So something which I have already mentioned, it is the widening inequalities in Malta. It is a reflection, and it is a part of the mechanisms by which inequalities, this gap, is becoming wider. First, there is those who have made a lot of money out of our space, those who have exploited it. That means that they have accumulated more. not accumulated more just in terms of capital, but also of the power they have. They have more. They have control over space. They control it, but they also have more political influence. The power that these class have accumulated, it means that there is inequalities that are growing, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of the decision-making and how it's taken. It is this economic, I would say social class that have become so strong, partly through the exploitation of space. We have seen, we don't talk a lot about this in Malta, but we are seeing increasingly gentrification, where working class neighborhoods, they are no longer affordable to those living there. Now this is, again, it can be a bit tricky, because actually most of those working class neighborhoods, they are inhabited by persons who own their place. So they didn't have to leave their place because they could no longer afford the rent, in most cases. In some cases, that took place too. But there is an issue now with their children, that their children, and so initially one could think, so this is a good thing, you know, I am a working class person, maybe my income is not that high, it's average, below average, but I own a house, and now that house is worth a lot. And it's true. But you're living in it. I mean, it's not that you can do a lot with it, because you're living in it. You don't want to turn a profit from your house because you want to live there. But then your children, if they wish to live in the same locality as you, it will be increasingly hard for them. They will have to move out because they will no longer afford that. I'm talking about places such as Birgu, for example. And this is something that, I mean, this is probably the most important feature of the neoliberal model. It is that the decisions, and it links very much to the first point, the decisions are taken outside the democratic sphere. And in planning, this can be felt and seen so tangibly. You feel that whatever is being done, we had the recent controversy on the Villa Rosa development in St. Julian's, where government brazenly was saying, I want to change the local plan so that it wasn't saying this, but it was so clear it couldn't even be denied, I would say. It was saying, you know, I will change the local plan, I will change the law so this particular developer can build this project he wants to do. You know, there is no democratic process in all this. And it's happening all the time in the planning. We've been fighting for years now an absurd situation where in Malta, in whatever sphere, a decision that is taken and is being appealed in a court doesn't become implementable. It cannot be executed until the appeal ends and there is a final decision on that issue. There is just one exception, and that is the planning sphere. There, a decision taken by the planning authority in Malta can become immediately executable. Then you can take it to court, you can take it first to a tribunal, then you take the case to court, and you may win, and we do often win because we know that the planning authority and the decisions it takes, I mean, are often not in line with what even the lax laws that we have, but the building would then already have been built. And of course, the authorities won't go to tear it down. It will be left there. So, you know, that's again, it's something that is very undemocratic, where even like this basic rule of law does not apply to a case like this. But this is what happens. And all of this is because there is lobbying, there is this power, the structural influence from a class of developers, but I wouldn't say developers only, from the big business class where they want this status quo in place, and they want actually more than the status quo in place. They want always to increase this geographical expansion for profits. Something else, and now I move to the how this space now affects us, impacts us, forms us as an individual. It is a very hyper-consumeristic space. Now, all the places, most of places that we go to, it's places where we have to consume and where we have to show that we are consuming, and where the consumption aspect is the main aspect of it. It is also what creates our identities. For example, something that came to mind, it's impressive, I would say, how birthdays for children became something that is increasingly expensive, and that is done in these private venues and bars where thousands of euros are spent simply to make a party for your child. And often, you know, the idea of having that party is in itself the meaning of it. It's about who you are, who your identity is, where you belong. Also, the youth use of space, it's becoming increasingly individualistic. Actually, youth, I would say, my impression is that they are using the public spaces increasingly less. It's more confined or to their homes or to very specific private places that exist. There is less this youth use of public space. Yeah, so for example, Malta had even, again, in 2014 or 15, or a bit later than that, where a law was passed to commercialize public sport facilities in Malta. So now even places like football grounds, like gyms that were given by government to local organizations, for example, can be considered as public anymore. Now a very large chunk of them can be commercialized, they can be made like old people's homes, cafeterias, gyms where you pay. So yeah, it's increasingly about consumption. And again, the consumption is not the issue. Consumption, there have always consumption. It's when consumption becomes the main thing. It's as the central organizing principle of life, the main signifier of status, of identity, belonging. And that, of course, leads to a widening of social inequalities too, because not everyone has the ability to consume in the same way and to the same extent. And it's about our experiences. There is the commodification of experiences. Like almost any experience in life has to be tied to money, to paying for something, has to be tied to the profits of someone. I will get to it very soon, but I remember being in a press conference in Gozo together with band clubs and other groups in St. George's Square that has been taken over by the commercial establishments there. And you could see that the speakers there were really making the point, it's not just that we have a right to use this place for the festa, but there was a wider point. It's about what you can do in life. Like what we can do in life is not simply to sit down and purchase something from a restaurant. There are other forms of activities, of meaningful activities that can be done, but no space is being left for them. So this has to do with and of course there are still strong, and I would say it's still widespread, like for example, the festa, fireworks in Malta, they are still activities that are very much perhaps outside the commodification aspect, or at least partly. But that space is, I think, ever in terms now of the physical space of where it can take place, is becoming increasingly restricted. It's about now how it shapes us, the individual aspirations. The neoliberal model is very much about the individual. It's your individual choice. It's not about collectivities being a member of a collective, but about defining ourselves, our aspirations, what we want in life, in terms of us, the individual, having that particular object, being in that particular place because it feels that it's giving value to me by being in that particular place. And this is, I think, something that partly we come to desire the neoliberal space, because it is being portrayed that that is a space of value, being in the appearance of luxury, in this hyper-consumption aspect. That is, you know, that is in the dominant neoliberal value system, that's something that's placed at the top of it. So by being there, it's giving value to me. I feel that I have value because I am in that space. So I also come to desire the neoliberal space. And it's very much that this space is not seen as shared. It is not something that is about collective responsibility, but it is always, it's always divided according to the logic of profit, individual consumption, and that has an effect on us. That forms us, who we are, how we feel we are expected to behave in life. And it makes us forget about important things like this, like the freedom to make, the fact that we should have a voice in making the cities, not cities only, I would say, that we should have a role in place making. Places shouldn't just be imposed there according to the logic of flows. And maybe, yes, maybe we participate in that, but we actually do not have a voice. It's something that is being decided somewhere else. And that is a neglected human right. It means that we do not have control, and I think it does lead to a lot of frustration. Frustration that then could be, for example, expressed in xenophobia, because a visible aspect of flows is migration. So it's very, for example, easy to project that frustration, this feeling of non-control over space that is there, but perhaps I'm not managing to articulate it and to think consciously about that. But the frustration is there, and that is then projected on migrants, for example, because they are a very clear and tangible aspect of these flows. And I think this explains a lot of things about the modern frustrations and the inequalities that exist, and the people being angry, the people also voting for the far right, because there is this sense that we lost control. We lost control over, for example, how we can shape our space. So it's very easy that we vote for a person who is telling us that they will bring back that control. Of course, it does not happen in practice then. Usually, those same persons are those who will actually make all the power, these dynamics even worse. But that promise, it's something that is very attractive to many in this context. But as these are the last few slides, as I said at the start, this is not something that is absolute. The people do not simply accept the neoliberal model as is. There is a tension. They feel they might have a stake in it. They are partly formed and shaped by it. All of us are. But also, it feels sometimes that it's not right. There are conflicting views, ideas, experiences that we have never to lose sight of the real practical life experience. Whatever can be depicted as seeing something we should aspire to, as something that is beautiful, modern, and yes, that influences our values. but also within our living our lives. We are going to work, we are going out, walking in the streets, and that is where the real life experience can meet the very negative effects of this neoliberal space, where we can feel, that there is some inequality here, that the power is embodied in space, and maybe we start getting a better understanding of it. And so, so it does find resistance from different groups. It could be residents, it could be workers, it could be Festa enthusiasts, because those conflicts, however, are never just about a piece of land. It's never about one particular building. It might be partly, but it's about wider visions of life, of the power, how it works, who should have a voice, who does not, who should benefit, who is not benefiting from something. As we said in the beginning, places become so because they are symbolic constructions. They are full of meanings, they are related to collective identities. So when there is a conflict on place, it is about wider questions that will be maybe consciously or unconsciously referring to who are we, where do we belong, what is our place in this world, how do we want to live, what do we value most. And that could partly at least come in conflict with this neoliberal model that simply is looking about the individual choice and the free market. The people sometimes express the desire for something that is perhaps different, for something that is more driven by community organization instead of this undemocratic decision-making that happens only according to the logic of profits. People, I think, are increasingly valuing the quality of life and the social relations. This is, I think, so important. It is a system, the neoliberal system is one that makes us forget, that really relegates, marginalizes the idea that who we are and whether we feel good or not is very much dependent on what social relations we have in life. The collective aspirations. You could see the people in villages, for example, or towns opposing projects and how they would refer to, the collective, the village, and the shared experiences when they were. So it's not just, it's not just about this place. It's not just about me, how I will be affected negatively by having this building here, but it's also who we are, the identity. So that is kind of being erased by something that, will put on a different logic to it. Solidarity versus greed. It's never completely one or the other. Usually, these feelings and these pull effect is happening on both sides because we are shaped by what's happening around us in the neoliberal space. So, but we have seen a lot of examples where communities, groups have fought back, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But I think if there is a good fight, success is always there. Maybe that project, maybe it would still take place, but still the fact that we, articulated something in terms of an alternative, of a way of being in this life, in this country, in this case, that's already a success in itself. Something like the Front Contra Golf course in the 90s and 2000s, where there were farmers. Again, for example, the link of farmers to their land, it was a very important part of it. They were opposed, successfully in this case, the building of a golf course for the ultra-rich. Recently, the Yacht Marina in Marsaskala, again, The community successfully opposed the building of a yacht marina in the middle of their town, where all the social activities take place, where most of the communal aspect is to be taken over, again, by these flows, by the flows of money, in this case, of objects for the super rich. Zone or Point, same, huge protests, took over many years. In the end, it was partly a success, where the public land that had been privatized was returned back to government. The ITSDB, it wasn't a success in this case. Now, if you go to Pembroke and St. Julian's, you will see that there are tens of cranes there that are building it, but the people really put up a big fight. And I think there was value in it, because it was one of the first fights since 2018 where residents groups started taking a prominent role, speaking out themselves, organizing, going around, distributing flyers, saying we want something different, They were trying to tell them, the property of your homes will increase if we have such a luxury development next to you. Most would say, well, we're not sure that actually would take place, but even if it does, this is where I live. This is where my quality of life is. Having something that will bury me alive, it's simply a no-go for me. Manuel Island, again, a privatized space where activist action at the start, but then also the community participated a lot in restoring access to it after 16 years. And I remember this was really emotional for me. The people, like older persons, would come crying, saying, I never thought I would see this place open again. This is where I spent so many years of my life playing with other children here. I know every corner of it. It's something that has meaning to me, but it's something that has meaning. It's not just something that has meaning to me as an individual. It has meaning to me because it was a shared experience. Residents fighting against the occupation of spaces by commercial establishments, what I referred to earlier, the press conference in St. George's Square with the active participation of different groups. Even I would have to say for example, the Marsaskala Marina, it wasn't just residents. It was the different groups that united. It was fishers, it was people from the Festa, so many different groups, like they found this solidarity to fight back against something like this, and that's why they won at the end of the day. Comino, it's still an ongoing battle. We'll see. But again, there was, we had done as Graffiti an action there in June 2022, where we went to remove deck chairs from the beach. And I mean, it was, like something we had planned, but we never thought that the response was going to be what it was. The people were like so angry at the situation. Everyone was, like it's not possible that the private interests take over our places in this way. And I'm sure that all that anger wasn't simply about this specific place. It was about something much wider, about our place in this world, who we are, who has interests, who has the power. So a lot of these symbolic constructions came into play. They expressed themselves in terms of place, in this case, but it's went much beyond place itself. It's about politics, the economy, the social divisions that are expressed through, in this case, through conflicts over space. Okay, I think I've said enough, and probably I went over the time allocated, but that's all. Thank you.